The man who called himself Silas Croft believed the world was a machine of levers and gears, and that people were just soft parts that could be wedged into place with the right application of paper and pressure. He stood on the splintered platform of the Redemption train station, a place that smelled of coal smoke and desperation, and held up the papers that proved his point. They were indenture contracts, crisp and official, and they gave him ownership, body and soul, of the two children standing beside him. The girl, Ilara, was perhaps 10 years old. Her frame was a sketch of a child, all sharp angles and hollows, lost inside a dress made of patched flour sacks. She kept one arm wrapped tight around her brother, Leo, a smaller, silent version of herself. His eyes, wide and dark, were fixed on the dusty toes of his bare feet. They did not cry or tremble. They had learned that stillness was their only armor. Orphans of the line. Croft's voice boomed, slicing through the afternoon heat. He was a man built of soft flesh and hard certainty, his suit too fine for the grit of the town. A tragedy, yes, but an opportunity for the industrious. Strong backs for your ranch, nimble fingers for your shop. Sanctioned by the territorial government and the transcontinental railroad itself. A few listless townspeople watched from the shade of the general store's porch. They saw two children, chattel on a platform, and a man selling them like livestock. It was an ugly sight, but Croft had the law on his side. The papers he waved were a shield against their conscience. From the edge of the small crowd, a man watched. He did not belong here. Kalen was a creature of the high peaks, of granite and pine, where the only laws were those of season and survival. The town of Redemption was a necessary poison he endured twice a year for salt, flour, and steel traps. His hair was long, the color of winter bark, and his face was a landscape of solitude, carved by wind and loss. He had come for supplies, nothing more. He intended to be back in the silence of his mountain before the sun touched the western ridge. But he saw the children. And in the hollows of their eyes, he saw ghosts. He saw a small face, cherubic and laughing. He saw a woman's hand, gentle in his own. Memories sealed away by scar tissue and silence, now cracked open by the raw ugliness of the scene before him. Croft was working the small crowd, his voice a slick oil of persuasion. Think of the investment. Years of labor for pennies a day. This boy, he's quiet, won't give you no trouble. The girl, she can cook and clean. They're a matched set. A hard-faced rancher with hands like stone stepped forward, spitting a stream of tobacco juice near Leo's feet. The boy flinched, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement. But Kalen saw it. He saw the girl's arm tighten around her brother, her knuckles white. It was a small act of defiance. A hopeless one. The rancher grunted. How much for the pair? A bargain, Croft said, smiling a predator's smile. A signing fee of $20 to cover my administrative costs, and they are yours to feed and house as you see fit for the next 8 years. The ghosts in Kalen's mind screamed. They were the echoes of a fire, the scent of smoke and shattered timber, the phantom weight of a small body he had failed to carry from the flames. His wife, his son. Gone. The fire had taken them, and it had taken his future, leaving him scarred inside and out, a man hollowed into an echo. He had sworn off the world of men, but the world had just presented him with a cruelty he could not turn his back on. He felt his own hands clench into fists at his sides. The callus on his palms were thick from the axe and the plow, but they felt sensitive now, raw. He had built a fortress of solitude to keep the pain out, but he was learning that some fortresses are built to be breached. The rancher was reaching into his pocket, pulling out a worn leather pouch. Croft's eyes gleamed. The transaction was almost complete. The children's fate was about to be sealed in grime and sweat and callous ownership. Ilara looked up then. For a second, her gaze swept past the leering rancher, past the smug railroad agent, and met Kalen's. In her eyes, he did not see pleading. He saw a terrible, ancient resignation that no child should ever know. It was the look of a trapped animal that has given up the fight. And that, more than anything, is what made him move. The world of men had failed these children. It had failed him. But perhaps two wrongs could, for once, make something right. Kalen took a step forward. Then another. He moved through the sparse crowd like a boulder parting a stream. The townspeople shuffled aside, their curiosity piqued by this silent, formidable man from the mountains. He stopped directly in front of Croft, his shadow falling over the children, eclipsing the harsh sun. He was taller than Croft by a head, wider by a foot. He said nothing. He simply stood there, a bulwark of quiet condemnation. Croft's smile tightened. He was not accustomed to being challenged. "Sir, if you'll excuse us, we are conducting business." Kalen's eyes, the color of a stormy sky, did not waver from Croft's. His voice, when it came, was low and rough, like stones grinding together. "How much?" The question hung in the hot, still air. The rancher paused, his hand hovering over his pouch. Croft's face flushed with irritation. "I beg your pardon? These children are being indentured, not sold. It is a legal arrangement for their welfare." He brandished the papers again, a talisman he believed made him invincible. Kalen's gaze flickered to the documents, then back to Croft's face. "The papers," he repeated, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "How much?" Croft felt a surge of anger at this uncivilized brute's insolence. He wanted to humiliate him, to dismiss him. He would name a price so insulting it would drive the man away in shame. He laughed, a short, ugly bark. "You want to buy my trouble? Fine. $1." He named the price of a cheap drink, of nothing. He expected the mountain man to glower and retreat. Kalen did not glower. He did not retreat. His expression did not change at all. He reached into the pocket of his worn canvas trousers and pulled out a single, heavy silver dollar. It was worn smooth with time, its details blurred. He held it out. Croft stared at the coin, then at Kalen's unblinking eyes. This was not how the game was played. The big man was not supposed to call his bluff. A flicker of uncertainty crossed Croft's face, but his pride was at stake now, in front of the whole town. With a sneer, he snatched the coin from Kalen's palm. "Done," Croft spat, as if the word tasted foul. Kalen's hand moved, faster than Croft expected. He did not take the papers. He simply plucked them from Croft's grasp. He folded the documents once and tucked them into his shirt. Then, he turned his attention to the children. He knelt. It was a slow, deliberate movement, like a great tree bending. He was now at their eye level. Ilara flinched, pulling Leo tighter against her. They had been owned by many men. This was just another one, bigger and quieter than the rest, but an owner all the same. Kalen said nothing to them. He simply held out his hand, palm up. It was a large hand, scarred and calloused, but it was steady. It was not a command. It was an offer. Ilara stared at the hand. It was different from the hands that had pushed and struck them. Different from the soft, grasping hand of Silas Croft. This hand was a tool, made for work, for building, and for holding. After a long moment that stretched into an eternity, she slowly, tentatively, uncurled her fingers from her brother's arm and placed her small, trembling hand into Kalen's. It was as light as a fallen leaf. Kalen's fingers closed gently around hers. He stood, drawing her to her feet. With her other hand, she kept her grip on Leo, pulling him along. Kalen turned and, without a backward glance at the stunned and silent town, began to walk away from the station, leading the two children into an unknown future. The journey up the mountain was a silent one. The path was steep, winding through stands of aspen and dark, solemn pine. Kalen walked ahead, his pace measured to accommodate the children's shorter legs. He still held Ilara's hand. Her grip remained tentative, a bird poised for flight, but she did not pull away. Leo trailed behind them, a silent shadow clutching the back of his sister's ragged dress. Ilara watched the man's back. It was a wall of muscle and faded canvas. He moved with an easy, powerful grace, as comfortable in this wild terrain as a wolf or a bear. She was terrified. She had been passed from one stranger to another since her parents had succumbed to fever a year ago. She knew the signs of a bad man, the quick temper, the shifty eyes, the false smile. This man was different. He had no smile at all. His silence was as vast and unnerving as the wilderness around them. She did not know if that was better or worse. For Kalen, the silence was a familiar comfort, but the small hand in his was a foreign country. It was a link to a world he had abandoned. With every step, the phantom weight of it seemed to grow, sending echoes of sensation up his arm and into the hollow chamber of his chest. He remembered another small hand, plump and trusting, that had once held his finger. The memory was a dull ache, a ghost limb he had learned to live without. Now, the feeling was returning, sharp and new. He could feel the children's exhaustion. Their footsteps faltered on the rocky inclines. He did not offer words of encouragement. Words were not his tools. Instead, he stopped, and without a sound, he lifted Leo onto his broad shoulders. The boy stiffened, a gasp escaping his lips, but he did not struggle. He was too light. A bundle of sticks and fear. Kalen adjusted the boy's weight and continued the climb, his hand still holding Ilara's. They reached his cabin as the sky began to bleed into shades of orange and purple. It was not a large place, built of thick, hand-hewn logs, with a stone chimney and a roof of packed earth and sod. It looked as if it had grown out of the mountainside itself. Smoke curled from the chimney, a thin grey ribbon against the darkening sky. Inside, a fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting a warm, dancing light across the single room. The air smelled of wood smoke, pine, and drying herbs. The cabin was sparse, almost monastic. A sturdy table with 2 chairs, a bed built into one wall, shelves holding a few books and tin plates. It was impeccably clean, the floor swept, the blankets on the bed folded with precision. It was the home of a man who lived a deliberate, solitary life. Kalen gently set Leo down on his feet. He gestured toward the fire. "Warm yourselves." The children crept toward the hearth, drawn by the heat. They stood before it, holding out their hands, their small, ragged forms silhouetted by the flames. Kalen moved to a pot simmering over the embers. He ladled a thick, savory stew into 2 wooden bowls. It was rich with rabbit and wild vegetables. He placed the bowls on the table, along with 2 spoons. He did not invite them to eat. He simply put the food there and stepped back, busying himself with checking the latch on the cabin door. Ilara watched him. Every man she had known ate first, taking the best portions. This man served them and then retreated, giving them space. Her hunger was a sharp, gnawing pain in her belly, but her caution was stronger. She looked at Leo. His eyes were fixed on the steaming bowl. She took a deep breath, took her brother by the hand, and led him to the table. She pulled a chair out for him, a gesture of profound and practiced care. Then she took the other chair herself. She picked up her spoon and dipped it into the stew, but she didn't eat. She blew on the spoonful to cool it and held it out to Leo's lips. He opened his mouth and accepted the food, his first bite in this strange, new place. Only after her brother had eaten did Ilara take a bite for herself. The warmth of the stew spread through her, chasing away some of the deep, settled cold. It was the best thing she had ever tasted. Kalen watched them from the shadows, his back against the far wall. He saw the girl's quiet act of protection. He saw the way she cared for her brother before herself. It was a gesture of love so pure and fierce it almost hurt to witness. In that small, selfless act, he saw the echo of his wife, Mariah, the way she had always looked after their son, Daniel. The memory was a knife twist, but for the first time in years, the pain was mingled with something else. Something warm. He ate his own portion later, standing by the fire after the children were asleep. He had made a bed for them on the floor near the hearth, a soft mattress of pine boughs covered with a thick fur pelt. They were huddled together under a wool blanket, their faces soft and peaceful in the firelight. The silence of the cabin was different now. It was not empty. It was filled with the soft sound of 2 children breathing. Kalen felt like an intruder in his own home. He was a guardian, a protector, but the role felt alien, a piece of clothing that no longer fit. He had bought them for $1. He had saved them from Croft. But what now? He did not know how to be with people anymore, especially not with children. He knew how to track a deer, how to read the weather in the clouds, how to survive a blizzard. He had forgotten how to offer comfort. The days that followed fell into a quiet rhythm. Kalen would rise before dawn, rekindle the fire, and leave the cabin to check his trap lines or chop wood. When he returned, there would be fresh water in the bucket and a stack of firewood by the hearth. The children never spoke to him. They moved about the cabin with the quiet, fearful grace of mice, always watching him, always together. Elara took it upon herself to care for their small corner of the world. She swept the floor with a crude broom Kalen had made. She washed their bowls in the stream. She patched their threadbare clothes with a needle and thread she found in a small wooden box on a shelf. They were small acts of domesticity, a desperate attempt to create order in a life that had been nothing but chaos. One evening, a storm rolled in, cloaking the mountain in mist and a driving rain. The wind howled around the cabin, rattling the single window pane. Leo, who had been silent for as long as Elara could remember, began to tremble. A clap of thunder, sharp and violent, shook the very logs of the cabin. A small whimper escaped the boy's lips. Kalen was sharpening a knife by the fire. He heard the sound. He looked over and saw the sheer terror on the boy's face. Elara was holding him, whispering reassurances that were lost in the roar of the storm. Kalen's first instinct was to do nothing, to remain in his fortress of silence. But the boy's whimper was the sound of a wounded animal, and it struck a chord deep inside him. He put down his knife and the whetstone. He walked over to a large wooden chest in the corner of the room, the one he never opened. His hands hesitated over the lid. This was where he kept the past. The few things he had managed to pull from the fire. A locket. A child's drawing. A woman's shawl. He lifted the heavy lid. The scent of cedar and old memories filled the air. He reached inside and pulled out a small, carved wooden bird. Its wings were outstretched, its form simple but elegant. He had carved it for Daniel for his 5th birthday. The birthday Daniel never reached. He walked back to the children. He knelt, just as he had at the train station. He held out the wooden bird to Leo. The boy shrank back, burying his face in his sister's side. Elara looked from the bird to Kalen's face. His expression was unreadable, but in the firelight, she saw something in his eyes. It wasn't pity. It was something deeper, something that looked like shared pain. Slowly, she reached out and took the bird from Kalen's hand. The wood was smooth and warm. She turned it over and over, then offered it to Leo. "Look, Leo. A bird. It's for you." Leo peeked out from behind her arm. He saw the bird. His trembling subsided slightly. He reached out a hesitant finger and touched its wing. Kalen remained kneeling for a moment longer. He watched the boy's tentative touch, and felt a thawing in a place he had thought was frozen solid. He stood and returned to the fire, turning his back to them. As he stoked the flames, his sleeve rode up his forearm. The firelight illuminated the skin. It was a gnarled, puckered landscape of old burns, the tissue a angry red and silver web that stretched from his wrist to his elbow. He was aware of it, aware that Elara was watching. For a moment, he considered pulling his sleeve down, hiding the evidence of his failure. But he didn't. He let her see. He let her see the scars that marked him as a man who had survived a fire, a man who had lost everything. Elara's gaze was fixed on his arm. She saw the scarred flesh, and something shifted inside her. Fear was a constant companion, but for the first time, it was joined by something else, understanding. This silent, formidable man was not just a giant. He was wounded. Like them. His scars were on the outside, while hers and Leo's were on the inside, but they were scars all the same. In that silent moment of shared vulnerability, a fragile thread of trust was spun in the warm, firelit cabin. A week passed, a stretch of time measured in meals shared in silence and the growing pile of firewood outside the door. The fragile piece of the mountain was a balm, but Kalen knew it was temporary. The world below had not forgotten them. He was running low on flour and salt, necessities he could not forage from the wilderness. The trip to redemption was unavoidable. Leaving the children was a new kind of anxiety. He stood at the cabin door, a canvas sack over his shoulder. "Stay inside," he commanded, his voice rougher than he intended. "Bolt the door. Do not open it for anyone." Elara nodded, her hand already on Leo's shoulder. She watched him descend the path until he was swallowed by the trees. The silence he left behind was heavier than the silence when he was there. She slid the thick wooden bolt across the door, the sound echoing in the small space. It was the first time they had been truly alone in their new home, and she was not sure if it felt safer or more dangerous. Kalen moved through the town with his usual guarded stride, but this time, the world felt different. He was not just a solitary man buying supplies, he was a guardian. The thought was both a burden and a strange, unfamiliar anchor. He bought his flour and salt at the general store, ignoring the curious stares and whispered comments from the other patrons. As he was loading his supplies onto his pack mule, a voice cut through the air. "There he is. The child thief." Kalen turned. Silas Croft stood in the middle of the dusty street, and beside him, looking deeply uncomfortable, was Sheriff Brody. Croft's face was a mask of smug righteousness. "Sheriff," Croft announced, his voice carrying for all to hear, "I told you he would show his face. That man stole 2 children, property of the Transcontinental Railroad, from my legal custody." Sheriff Brody, a weary man whose badge seemed to weigh him down, stepped forward. "Kalen," he said, his voice tired. "Mr. Croft here has filed a formal complaint. He says you abducted 2 orphans under his charge." "I paid him," Kalen stated simply. The fact was as solid as granite in his mind. Croft scoffed loudly. "He gave me $1, Sheriff." A mocking gesture. "I have the official indenture papers." He has nothing but brute force. He took advantage of a chaotic situation. "The law is on my side." Sheriff Brody sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. He was a man caught between the town's powerful railroad interests and the quiet mountain man he knew to be honest, if strange. "Kalen, the papers do give him a claim. A judge would see it that way. You can't just buy children for $1. He was selling them," Kalen repeated, his voice low and dangerous. "To a man who would have broken them. I was securing their future." Croft blustered. "And I want them back. The railroad demands it." Kalen's jaw tightened. He could feel the eyes of the town on him. He saw judgment, suspicion, and a little fear. He knew he could not win a war of words with a man like Croft. And he would not fight the sheriff. He needed a different kind of weapon. He finished tying his sack to the mule, his movements deliberate. "They are safe," he said to the sheriff, ignoring Croft completely. "They are fed. They are not being hurt." "That may be," Brody said, his expression troubled. "But the law is the law. A circuit judge is due in redemption in 3 days. He will hold a hearing. You bring the children back to town by then, or I will have to come up to that mountain with a warrant for your arrest." The threat hung in the air. 3 days. It was a deadline, a countdown to losing the fragile world he had just begun to build. Kalen gave a single, sharp nod. He turned his back on them and led his mule toward the path that led out of town, the weight of the flour on the animal's back nothing compared to the weight of the ultimatum on his own. He did not go straight back to the mountain. He went to the one place in town where he might find a different kind of strength. He stopped outside the small clapboard building that served as the town's schoolhouse. Martha, the school teacher, was sweeping the porch. She was a widow in her late 50s, a woman whose gentle face was lined with kindness and intelligence. She was one of the few people in Redemption who had ever offered Kalen a kind word without wanting something in return. She looked up as his large frame cast a shadow over her. "Kalen," she said, her surprise evident. "It's good to see you." She saw the trouble in his eyes before he said a word. "Come inside. The dust is terrible today." Inside, the schoolhouse smelled of chalk dust, old paper, and beeswax. Kaelin stood awkwardly amongst the small desks, a giant in a child's world. Martha listened patiently as he told the story, his words sparse and unadorned, yet powerful in their simplicity. He spoke of the platform, the rancher, the dollar, the look in the girl's eyes. When he finished, Martha was silent for a long moment. "Silas Croft is a wicked man," she said finally, her voice firm. "He wraps his greed in the flag of the law. I've heard whispers about him before. Other children he has placed in mining camps or remote ranches. Children no one ever hears from again." "The judge will listen to his papers," Kaelin said. It was a statement of fact, not defeat. "Papers can be fought with other papers," Martha countered, her eyes sharp. "Or with the truth. Croft must have records, a ledger. Something that details his transactions. If you could prove he is not a guardian but a trafficker, that he profits from selling these children, then no judge would side with him." The idea took root in Kaelin's mind. A ledger. A tangible piece of evidence. It was a hunt, something he understood. "The railroad office," he said, more to himself than to her. "It will be locked and guarded," Martha warned. "But his power is in those documents. Without them, he is just a blowhard in a fancy suit. You have 3 days, Kaelin. But you are not alone in this." Her words, "You are not alone," struck him with unexpected force. For years, being alone had been his goal, his shield. Now, this small, determined woman was offering an alliance. He gave her a grateful, almost imperceptible nod, and left, his purpose clear. He had to protect his home, and he had to expose a villain. The two tasks were now one and the same. While Kaelin was in town facing the return of the past, Ilara was discovering a voice she did not know she possessed. She found a small nub of charcoal in the cold ashes of the hearth. On a whim, she picked it up. She found a piece of smooth, discarded plank Kaelin had been using as a cutting board. The surface was pale and inviting. Hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence, she began to draw. She did not draw the mountains or the trees. She drew what was inside her. She drew a tall, thin man with a cruel smile and a piece of paper in his hand, Croft. She drew a dark, crowded train car. She drew a succession of faces, harsh and uncaring. It was a visual diary of her life before the mountain, a world of shadows and fear. Then, she turned the plank over. On the clean side, she began to draw again. She drew a cabin with smoke curling from its chimney. She drew a crackling fire. She drew 2 small figures huddled together, and standing behind them, a tall, broad-shouldered man, his face in shadow, watching over them. It was not a perfect likeness, but it was a perfect truth. It was a drawing of safety. When Kaelin returned, the sun was low. He entered the cabin to find the children huddled by the fire. He set down the new sack of flour, his expression grim. Ilara watched him, sensing the new tension in him. She saw the worry etched around his eyes. He did not tell them what had happened in town. He did not speak of Croft or the sheriff or the 3-day deadline. He simply prepared their evening meal as usual. But the silence in the cabin was now charged with unspoken dread. Later that night, after the children were asleep, Kaelin sat by the fire, planning. The railroad office was his target. He knew he had to move under the cover of darkness. As he stared into the flames, his eyes fell upon the piece of wood leaning against the wall. He picked it up. He saw Ilara's drawings. He looked at the first side, at the stark depiction of cruelty. He saw Croft's caricature, the leering face of the rancher, the bars of the train car. It was a child's raw, unfiltered testimony. Then he turned it over. He saw his cabin, his fire, himself. He saw how she saw him as a protector. A guardian. The image struck him with the force of a physical blow. He was not just a man hiding from his past, he was a shield for their future. The drawing was a mirror, and in it, he saw a man he had not allowed himself to be for a very long time. It hardened his resolve into something unbreakable. The next day, Martha went to work. She did not march through the town shouting about injustice. That was not her way. She started with Sarah, the baker's wife, a woman known for her warm bread and her warmer heart. While buying a loaf, Martha spoke quietly of the two orphans, of their ragged clothes and the fear in their eyes. She did not mention Caelan at first, only the children. Silas Croft claims he is their savior, Martha said, her voice laced with quiet doubt. But I saw them, Sarah. They looked like frightened sparrows. The seed was planted. Sarah, a mother of 4, felt a pang of maternal sympathy. Later that day, when she saw Caelan pass by the bakery on his way to the blacksmith's, she did something impulsive. She wrapped a fresh, warm loaf of bread in a cloth, ran out, and pressed it into his hand. For the children, she whispered, and hurried back inside before he could respond. Caelan stood there for a moment, the warm loaf in his hand, a look of profound surprise on his face. Martha's next stop was the blacksmith, a burly man named Thomas whose opinion carried weight. She spoke of the law, and how sometimes the law could be twisted to serve wicked men. Caelan broke no law of God or man, she said. He saw an injustice and he acted. Thomas, a man who respected action over words, grunted. He had seen the transaction at the station. He'd thought it was strange then. Now, Martha's words cast it in a new light. When Caelan came to his forge to have a buckle mended, Thomas refused payment. For the mountain, he said, his highest compliment. Slowly, quietly, the tide of opinion in redemption began to turn. It was not a flood, but a slow, seeping change. The townspeople began to see the situation not as a legal dispute over property, but as a moral battle for the lives of 2 children. They saw Caelan not as a strange recluse, but as the only man who had been willing to stand up to Croft. That night, under a sliver of moon, Caelan became a shadow. He moved down the mountain and into the sleeping town, his steps silent. He reached the railroad office, a small, dark building next to the station. He tested the door. Locked. He moved to a side window. Using the tip of his hunting knife, he painstakingly worked the latch open. It slid back with a faint click. He slipped inside. The office smelled of stale cigar smoke and ink. A moonbeam cut across a large desk. On it, amidst a clutter of shipping manifests, was a thick, leather-bound ledger. Caelan's heart beat a slow, heavy drum against his ribs. He opened it. The first few pages were legitimate records of cargo. But then, the entries changed. He saw names. Miller Ranch Blackwood Mines. Next to them were sums of money, $50, $100. And then, a notation, 2 boys, age approximate 8, 1 girl, age approximate 12. It was not a record of indenture fees. It was a sales ledger. Silas Croft was not placing orphans, he was selling them into hard labor for a massive profit, pocketing the money himself and reporting only a minimal administrative fee to the railroad. He had found it. The truth on paper. He tucked the heavy ledger under his arm, slipped back out the window, and vanished into the darkness, the proof of Croft's crimes now his weapon. The day of the hearing dawned bright and clear, a beautiful day for a showdown. The town hall, which also served as the saloon on Saturday nights, was packed. Every chair was taken, and people stood 3 deep along the walls. An air of tense anticipation filled the room. At a long table at the front sat the circuit judge, a man named Sterling, whose face was as stern and impartial as the law books stacked before him. Silas Croft sat at one end of the table, looking confident and preening in his fine suit. At the other end sat Caelan. He wore his clean but worn canvas clothes, looking as out of place as a granite cliff in a ballroom. Beside him, small and quiet, sat Martha. The children were not present. Martha had insisted they be spared the ordeal, leaving them in the care of Sarah, the baker's wife. Judge Sterling banged his gavel. This hearing is convened to address the matter of 2 orphan wards of the territory, currently in the unauthorized care of Mr. Caelan. Mr. Croft, As the representative of the Transcontinental Railroad, you may present your case. Croft stood, holding his indenture contracts. He delivered a smooth, practiced speech about his solemn duty, the welfare of the children, and the sanctity of legal agreements. He painted Kalen as a brutish, unstable hermit who had impulsively kidnapped the children. The law is clear, Your Honor, he concluded, laying the papers on the table. These children are my responsibility. I demand their immediate return. The judge looked over the papers. He nodded grimly. The contracts appear to be in order. Mr. Kalen? Kalen stood. The entire room leaned forward. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet but carried to every corner of the packed hall. He was selling them. Croft jumped to his feet. Lies. Slander from a desperate man. You have proof of this accusation, the judge asked, his gaze fixed on Kalen. The price he asked was $1, Kalen said. That is not the price of a guardian. It is the price of contempt. Judge Sterling frowned. A strange matter, to be sure, but not proof of wrongdoing. Mr. Kalen, sentiment is not evidence. You acted outside the law. Do you have anything else to say? Kalen was a man of action, not oratory. He had the ledger, but he knew he needed more. He looked to Martha. She gave him a slight nod. I do, a new voice said. All heads turned. Ilara stood in the doorway of the hall, Leo holding her hand. Sarah the baker stood behind them, her expression resolute. The girl had refused to stay behind. She had a part to play. Croft's face went pale. Your Honor, this is inappropriate. The child should not be here. Let her approach, the judge commanded, his curiosity overriding his procedure. Ilara walked slowly to the front of the room. She did not look at Croft. She did not look at the judge. She looked at Kalen, and in his steady gaze, she found her courage. She was no longer the trembling girl from the station platform. She stood tall. Your Honor, Martha said, her voice clear and strong. This child has evidence to present. Ilara held up the piece of wood with her charcoal drawings. She showed the first side to the judge, the side with the dark, cruel figures. This was our life, she said, her voice small but clear as a bell. He took us from place to place. He told people we were orphans he was helping. Then she turned the wood over, showing the drawing of the cabin, the fire, and the tall, protective figure. This is our home. A murmur went through the crowd. The simple, powerful art told a story more effectively than any lawyer could. He hurt us, Ilara continued, her voice gaining strength. She looked directly at Croft now, and he shrank from her gaze. He hit Leo for crying. He didn't feed us if we didn't work. He told a man at a mine that my brother was strong and would be worth $50. Croft sputtered, lies. The child is confused, manipulated by this mountain man. Then perhaps, Kalen's voice boomed, cutting through Croft's panic denials, this will clear her confusion. He stepped forward and placed the heavy ledger on the table in front of Judge Sterling with a solid thud. His sales records, Kalen said. The judge opened the ledger. He read the first entry, his eyebrows raising. He read another, and his expression hardened. He flipped through the pages, a damning record of human trafficking disguised as corporate charity. The silence in the room was absolute. The townspeople stared at Croft, their suspicion turning to cold fury. Judge Sterling closed the ledger. He looked at Silas Croft, his eyes filled with contempt. Mr. Croft, he said, his voice dangerously quiet, you are a disgrace to the railroad you claim to represent and to the human race. Sheriff Brody, place this man under arrest. Sheriff Brody, his face set like stone, stepped forward and clamped a heavy iron cuff on Croft's wrist. Silas Croft, you're under arrest for fraud, endangerment, and human trafficking. Croft's bluster finally broke. He looked around widely, but saw only hostile faces. His power, built on paper and lies, had crumbled to dust. As the sheriff led a protesting Croft away, Judge Sterling looked at Kalen, and then at Alara and Leo, who had moved to stand beside him. "The indenture contracts are hereby declared null and void," the judge announced. "But that leaves the question of guardianship. These children are wards of the territory. They need a legal guardian." The room fell silent once more. Everyone looked at Kalen. This was the final hurdle, the one the law still held over him. He was a single man, a recluse. By all official standards, he was unfit. Kalen looked down at the two small faces looking up at him. He saw trust. He saw hope. He saw a future he never thought he would have. The ghosts of his past were finally silent, replaced by the living presence of these two children. He met the judge's gaze, and for the first time in front of the town, his voice was not flat or hard. It was filled with a raw, protective emotion that stunned everyone who heard it. "I am their guardian," he said. It was not a request. It was a statement of fact. A declaration of the heart. Before the judge could respond, Sarah the baker's wife spoke up from the crowd. "He saved them, Your Honor. They belong with him." Thomas the blacksmith's voice boomed, "He's a better man than any with a fancy suit and a piece of paper." One by one, the people of redemption, the very people who had once viewed him with suspicion, began to speak up. A wave of support filled the room, a community conscience awakened. They were no longer just spectators. They were witnesses, and they were taking a stand. Judge Sterling looked at the faces in the crowd, at the determined face of Martha, at the fierce protector Kalen, and at the two children who stood unflinching by his side. He saw a family, forged not by blood or law, but by courage and choice. A slow smile touched the judge's lips. "So be it," he declared, banging his gavel one last time. "Guardianship granted. This hearing is adjourned." The journey back up the mountain was different. There was no fear in Ilara's grip, only a comfortable connection. Leo did not trail behind, he walked beside her, clutching his wooden bird. When they reached the cabin, it no longer felt like Kalen's solitary shelter. It felt like their home. That evening, as Ilara helped Kalen patch a tear in his shirt, her movements easy and familiar, Leo sat by the fire. He looked at the carved bird in his hand, then up at Kalen, who was watching him. A small, wondrous sound filled the cabin, a sound no one had heard from him before. It was a laugh. Quiet, rusty, but a laugh all the same. Kalen felt it in his chest, a warmth that spread through him, mending cracks he didn't know were still there. He had lost a family to fire and flame. He thought that part of his life was over, reduced to ash and memory. But now, in the heart of his lonely mountain, he had found another. He had paid $1, not for ownership, but for a chance. A chance to heal, to protect, to love. The mountain was no longer his fortress against the world. It was the sanctuary where his world now lived.